History is filled with tales of kings, queens, and emperors. Some were wise, just, and beloved by their people. Others ruled with an iron fist, instilling fear to maintain their grip on power. But then there are those rare few, the ones who didn't just rule, but spiraled into a world so detached from reality that their reigns became legendary for all the wrong reasons. This is the story of one such emperor, a man whose name became a byword for excess, cruelty, and a complete descent into madness. His story is a chilling reminder of how absolute power can utterly corrupt a human soul. His name was Caligula, the third Roman emperor. When he first ascended to the throne, Rome celebrated. He was young, charismatic, and the son of the beloved General Germanicus. The people saw him as a breath of fresh air after the gloomy reign of his predecessor, Tiberius. His initial acts as emperor only fueled this optimism. He granted bonuses to the military, abolished unfair taxes, and freed citizens who had been unjustly imprisoned. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like a new golden age was dawning for Rome. But this hope was tragically short. A severe illness struck Caligula just a few months into his reign. He survived, but the man who emerged was different. The promising young ruler was gone, replaced by a tyrant whose actions grew more bizarre and terrifying by the day. He began to see himself not just as an emperor, but as a living god. He demanded that his statues be placed in temples and worshipped alongside the traditional deities. Anyone who dared to refuse was met with swift and brutal punishment. He would wander the palace at night, having conversations with the moon, demanding it come down to him. His palace, once the center of Roman governance, transformed into a theater of debauchery and cruelty. Lavish banquets would last for days, featuring exotic foods and endless wine, often ending in shocking displays of violence for the emperor's amusement. He took pleasure in humiliating the noble senators of Rome, forcing them to run alongside his chariot for miles, or making them serve him dinner dressed as slaves. The treasury which had been full when he took power was quickly drained to fund his extravagant lifestyle and colossal building. Projects like a 2-mile floating bridge built across the Bay of Naples for no other reason than to ride his horse across it. Perhaps the most famous story of his eccentricity involves his beloved horse. Caligula adored this horse more than any human. It had a marble stable, an ivory manger, and was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. The emperor even declared his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the highest political office in Rome. While historians debate whether he was serious or if it was just a profound insult to the Senate, the story perfectly captures the sheer absurdity of his rule. He was a man who had lost all sense of proportion, a man whose whims were law, no matter how insane. The whispers behind the golden walls grew louder. Stories of his scandalous personal life, his cruelty, and his sheer unpredictability spread throughout the empire. He executed people on a whim, confiscated the property of wealthy citizens to refill his empty coffers, and lived in constant paranoia, seeing conspiracies everywhere. The fear he inspired was immense, but so was the resentment. The people of Rome, who had once cheered for him, now lived in terror. The Senate, which he had systematically humiliated, began to plot. Caligula's reign of terror couldn't last forever. After just 4 years in power, his own guards, the Praetorian Guard, turned on him. The very men sworn to protect the emperor were the ones who brought his life to a violent end. His story serves as a stark warning from the pages of history. It's not just a tale of a mad emperor. It has a cautionary lesson about the dangers of unchecked power and what can happen when a leader loses touch with humanity. It shows us that beneath the crowns and the titles, rulers are still just people, and some, when given everything, lose. He was born into a world most of us can only dream of. Imagine, from your very first breath, being surrounded by the softest silk curtains, eating from plates made of pure gold, and having an army of servants ready to fulfill your every whim. This was his reality. Hunger. He never knew it. Struggle. A foreign concept. The word no was simply not in his vocabulary. He grew up believing the entire world was his to command, a playground built just for him. When the time came for him to ascend the throne, the people were filled with hope. They saw a young, vibrant ruler taking charge of a mighty empire. And why wouldn't they be optimistic? The imperial treasury was overflowing with gold. Merchant caravans and ships brought exotic goods from every corner of the known world, making the markets buzz with activity. The legions were disciplined, fiercely loyal, and undefeated on the battlefield. From the outside, the empire was a picture of absolute perfection, a shining beacon of strength and stability. It seemed nothing could possibly go wrong. But a foundation built on gold can still be fragile. The emperor, who had never faced a single hardship, saw the empire not as a responsibility, but as an extension of his personal desires. He viewed the vast treasury as his private wallet to be spent on lavish parties that lasted for weeks, on palaces so grand they scraped the heavens, and on gifts for friends who only told him what he wanted to hear. He saw the loyal armies not as protectors of the realm, but as his personal guards, a tool to display his power and intimidate anyone who dared to question him. The bustling trade routes, merely a source of more money for his extravagant lifestyle. The seasoned advisors and generals, men who had served his father and grandfather with unwavering loyalty, began to see the cracks forming. They tried to offer counsel, to gently steer him towards his duties. They spoke of dwindling grain reserves, of overtaxed provinces, and of rumblings of discontent along the borders. But their words were like whispers in a hurricane. The emperor, who had never been told no, did not appreciate their warnings. To him, their caution sounded like criticism, their wisdom like a challenge to his absolute authority. One by one, these wise voices were silenced. They were dismissed, exiled, or worse, accused of treason and quietly removed. In their place, the emperor surrounded himself with sycophants, young nobles who mirrored his own indulgence and praised his every foolish decision. The empire, that great and powerful entity, began to groan under the weight of his neglect. The gold that once seemed endless started to run dry. To fund his lifestyle, the emperor raised taxes to crippling levels. Farmers had to give up so much of their harvest that they couldn't feed their own families. Merchants, once the lifeblood of the economy, were taxed into bankruptcy. The vibrant markets grew quiet. The once loyal soldiers, stationed in faraway forts with dwindling supplies and no pay, started to question their allegiance. Their loyalty was to the empire, not to a ruler who seemed determined to bleed it dry for his own pleasure. The people's hope turned to desperation, and desperation curdled into anger. Small protests grew into widespread riots. The perfect facade of the empire crumbled, revealing a rotten core. The emperor, cocooned in his palace, remained blissfully unaware, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He was still the boy who had everything, unable to comprehend a world that wouldn't bend to his will. The fall was not a sudden event, but a slow, agonizing decay. The story of this emperor serves as a timeless warning that privilege without responsibility is a poison, and that even the mightiest empires can be brought to ruin, not by foreign enemies. Imagine stepping into a world crafted from pure spectacle, a palace so vast its marble floors seemed to stretch into eternity, each one a mirror reflecting the dance of 1,000 candles. This wasn't just a home, it was a universe unto itself, the heart of an empire beating to a rhythm of relentless extraction. The emperor, the architect of this grand illusion, had one simple, unwavering desire: to never, ever be alone with silence. Day and night, the great halls pulsed with life. Music was the air they breathed, a constant stream of melodies echoing from gilded ceilings and spiraling down grand staircases. One moment, it was the delicate plucking of a harp from the eastern wing. The next, a powerful symphony thundering from the grand ballroom. The sound never ceased, a deliberate shield against the quiet. Step outside, and you weren't met with tranquility, but with a different kind of sensory feast. The imperial gardens were a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Fountains, each a unique work of art, threw sparkling jets of water high into the air, their gentle splashing a constant, soothing percussion. Flowers from the farthest corners of the empire bloomed in a riot of impossible colors, their rare and potent fragrances mixing on the breeze to create a perfume that was uniquely the palace's own. It was naturi but polished, perfected, and orchestrated for maximum impact. Inside, a veritable army of people kept this world in motion. Servants, clad in fine livery, moved like ghosts through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. They worked tirelessly, polishing silver until it shone, replacing candles before they could gutter, and ensuring every surface was immaculate. They were the invisible gears of this magnificent machine, their perpetual motion a testament to the emperor's will. But the true stars of this court were the entertainers. The emperor's invitations were commands, and the most talented artists, musicians, dancers, and storytellers in the land flocked to the palace. It was the greatest stage they could ever hope for. Dancers with robes like butterfly wings would spin for hours, their movements a blur of silk and color. Acrobats would perform feats that defied gravity, drawing gasps from onlookers. Poets would weave tales of heroic deeds and mythical beasts, their voices rising and falling with the drama of their stories. The emperor would watch, his eyes moving from one performer to the next, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He craved the noise, the color, the ceaseless movement. He would host banquets that lasted for days, where the food was as much a spectacle as the entertainment. Mountains of exotic fruits, roasted meats glistening with spices, and deserts sculpted into fantastical creatures filled the tables. The goal wasn't just to eat, but to be overwhelmed. To have every sense engaged to its absolute limit. For the emperor, silence was a void, a cold, empty space he feared more than any invading army. He filled his life with a symphony of distractions, surrounding himself with a constant, dazzling performance. The palace wasn't just a symbol of his power and wealth. It was his fortress against the quiet, a vibrant, noisy, beautiful cage he had built for himself. The endless party was not just a celebration of life. It was a desperate, magnificent attempt to outrun the echoes of his own thoughts. And so, the music played on, the dancers spun, and the candles burned brightly, pushing back the shadows. In the heart of the empire, every night was a spectacle, a grand illusion of endless festivity. Imagined tables groaning under the weight of feasts, stretching as far as the eye could see. The air itself was thick with the scent of roasted meats, rare spices shipped from the farthest corners of the known world, and wine that flowed like rivers. Exotic fruits, treasures from distant, sun-drenched lands, were piled high in glistening pyramids, their vibrant colors a feast for the eyes, before they ever touched the lips. This was the court of the emperor, a world where the sun never seemed to set on celebration. But this was a paradise with a dark secret. The guests who thronged these gilded halls were not chosen for their wisdom, their skill, or their noble character. No, they were summoned for a single purpose: to entertain. They were jesters in fine silks, poets whose verses had to please, and nobles whose laughter was currency. The sound of merriment was a constant command, a chorus of forced joy that echoed off the marble walls. Smiles were not expressions of happiness. They were masks, worn for survival. Every guest, from the highest-ranking duke to the newest courtier, understood the unspoken rule: to be dull, to be morose. To show even a flicker of genuine sadness was to disappoint the emperor, and the emperor's disappointment was a terrifying thing. It was a shadow that could fall at any moment, swift and cold. One wrong word, one joke that didn't land, one smile that didn't reach the eyes, and your world could unravel. The price for failing to amuse was severe. It could mean the loss of your titles, your wealth, your home, or it could mean something far worse: exile to the desolate borderlands, or a quiet, permanent disappearance from the court altogether. So they laughed. They laughed until their sides ached and their jaws were sore. They told stories, sang songs, and danced with a desperate energy, each performance a plea to see another sunrise. They complimented the emperor's wit, marveled at his generosity, and toasted his name with goblets of the finest wine, all while a cold knot of fear tightened in their stomachs. They were actors on a magnificent stage, playing the part of the happy and contented, because in this kingdom of spectacle, authenticity was a crime. And the only thing more dangerous than the emperor's anger was his boredom. Beneath the shimmering surface of this nightly festival, a current of silent dread flowed. Friendships were fragile, built on the shifting sands of imperial favor. Alliances were temporary, broken as soon as one person's star began to fall. Everyone watched everyone else, their eyes constantly scanning for weakness, for a misstep, for any sign that someone was about to become the next victim of the emperor's insatiable need for amusement. The exotic fruits tasted of ash in their mouths, and the rare spices couldn't mask the scent of fear that truly permeated the air. It was a beautiful, glittering cage, and they were all just birds singing for their lives. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget. Ever wondered how a leader can control a whole nation, not just with armies, but with something far more seductive? Let's dive into the story of an emperor who mastered the art of control through pleasure. It's a tale that's more relevant today than you might think. This emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was a master psychologist. He discovered a powerful truth about human nature. People are drawn to comfort and luxury like moths to a flame. So, he built his empire on a simple, yet brilliant, foundation. He didn't just demand loyalty, he bought it. Imagine you're a court official. You see the emperor make a questionable decision. Do you speak up? Well, if you did, you might find yourself suddenly stripped of your beautiful home, your fine clothes, and your seat at the lavish royal feasts. You'd be cast out, silenced, maybe even forgotten. But what if you praised his decision, even if you knew it was wrong? Suddenly, you're rewarded. A bigger estate, rarer silks, a place of honor right next to him. The choice seems pretty clear, doesn't it? This system created a ripple effect throughout the entire kingdom. People learned the new rules of the game very quickly. Honesty was dangerous. Agreement was rewarded. The path to success wasn't paved with integrity, but with flattery. Courtiers competed to see who could offer the most extravagant praise, who could tell the most amusing story, who could entertain the emperor the best. The court transformed into a grand theater where everyone was an actor, playing a part for an audience of one. Behind all the forced smiles and roaring laughter, a quiet fear began to grow. It was a fear that settled deep in the bones. People saw injustice. They saw foolish policies. They saw the kingdom slowly veering off course. But the price of speaking the truth was just too high. It was safer to stay silent, to nod along, to become part of the chorus of praise. The silence of the good people became the emperor's greatest weapon. This isn't just a story from a dusty history book. This dynamic, this trade of truth for comfort, plays out in our own lives in smaller ways. Think about it, in workplaces and social circles, even sometimes in families. How often have we seen someone stay silent to avoid rocking the boat? How often do we choose the easier path of agreement over the difficult path of constructive criticism? The emperor's strategy was so effective because it didn't rely on brute force. He wasn't just a tyrant. He was a tempter. He offered a golden cage. The bars were made of luxury. The food was exquisite, and the view was beautiful. But it was still a cage. A cage that trapped not just their bodies, but their voices and their integrity. He made complicity feel comfortable, even desirable. What's the lesson here? The story of this emperor is a powerful reminder about the corrosive nature of fear and the importance of courage. It shows us that true strength isn't about gaining power through manipulation, but about fostering an environment where truth can be spoken without fear of punishment. It teaches us that a society built on lies, no matter how beautifully decorated, is fragile and destined to crumble. The most dangerous prisons are not the ones with iron bars, but the ones we build for ourselves when we trade our principles for a little bit of comfort and security. It is a timeless warning to always be wary of leaders who offer pleasure as a tool of control, and to find the courage to speak up, even when it's the hardest thing to do. Because in the end, a truth spoken in a whisper is more powerful than a lie shouted from a
Have you ever heard the story of the king who was so powerful, no one dared to speak the truth to him? It's a chilling tale, not just from a history book, but a timeless lesson about power and the silence it can command. Let's dive into a kingdom where fear wore the crown. Imagine a grand palace, halls lined with silk and gold, but filled with an invisible, suffocating dread. At its center sat a king, once a wise leader, now surrounded by a court of echoes. His reign began with promise, with victories on the battlefield and prosperity at home. He was celebrated, revered, and his word became absolute law. But somewhere along the way, his confidence curdled into arrogance, and his strength twisted into tyranny. It started subtly. An advisor, a man who had served the king's father, once raised a concern about a new tax. He argued it would burden the farmers and could lead to unrest. He presented his case with logic and respect. The next day, he was gone. No grand announcement, no public trial. He simply vanished. A quiet, terrifying message was sent. Dissent is not tolerated here. The king's will is not to be questioned. Soon, the smartest minds in the kingdom learned to be silent. The generals, who once debated strategy with the king for hours, now simply nodded in agreement. They saw what happened to the last commander who suggested a tactical retreat instead of a risky frontal assault. He was publicly shamed for cowardice and stripped of his rank. So now they led their men into battles they knew were unwinnable, all to appease the king's pride. The soldiers paid the price for their silence with their lives. The royal court, once a vibrant hub of debate and ideas, became a stage for flattery. Officials competed to see who could offer the most elaborate praise. They would compliment the king's attire, his wisdom, even the weather on days he went for a ride. Your Majesty, your insight is as boundless as the sky. One would say, your decree is a blessing upon us all. Another would chime in, truth was replaced by performance. The goal was no longer to serve the kingdom, but to survive the king's fragile ego. Even his own family, his wife and children, learnt to tread carefully. They saw the darkness in his eyes when confronted with anything less than perfect adoration. They would smile and agree, hiding their worries behind forced pleasantries. The palace became a lonely fortress for the king, surrounded by people but utterly alone with his power. He mistook their silence for loyalty, their fear for respect. Fear was the real ruler now. It dictated policy, it chose generals, and it wrote the laws. When fear is the chief advisor, truth becomes the first casualty. The kingdom began to rot from the inside. The treasury was drained on lavish projects to glorify the king. The army was weakened by poor strategies born of ego. The people suffered under unjust laws that no one dared to oppose. The king, insulated by a wall of yes-men, had no idea his kingdom was crumbling. He saw only smiling faces and heard only words of praise. He was blind and deaf to the reality of his own ruin. This story isn't just about a fictional king. It's a mirror that reflects a danger present in any structure of power in companies, in communities, even in our own personal relationships. When one person's voice becomes so loud that it drowns out all others, disaster is never far behind. True strength isn't about never being challenged. It's about having the wisdom to listen, the humility to be wrong, and the courage to surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth, especially when it's hard to hear. The moment we start punishing honesty and rewarding flattery, we begin building our own silent palace of fear. And in that silence, we lose touch with reality, with our allies, and ultimately, with ourselves. The fall of the kingdom wasn't a grand battle. It was a slow, quiet decay, born from the death of truth. It's a powerful reminder that the most courageous act is often not to wield power, but to speak truth to it. What do you think? Have you ever seen a situation where fear silenced important?
Have you ever wondered how empires crumble? It's not always with a bang, a great war, or a sudden rebellion. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, a story told in a hushed tone, a joke shared between soldiers, a line written in a secret diary. This is the story of how an emperor's world began to unravel, not on the battlefield, but in the taverns, marketplaces, and barracks of his own kingdom. Imagine the heart of the empire, the Grand Palace, a symbol of power, order, and stability. But what happens when the stories leaking from behind its golden gates are anything but orderly? Rumors began to trickle out, like a slow poison seeping into the city's water supply. At first, they were just murmurs. Merchants, gathered in bustling port cities, would lower their voices after a business deal was struck. Have you heard, one might say, about the feasts in the palace? They say the wine flows until dawn and the music never stops. Another would add, with a knowing glance, more than just music, my friend, more than just music. These weren't tales of statesmanship or wise governance. They were tales of indulgence, of excess, of a court lost in pleasure. The whispers traveled. They found their way to the soldiers, the very men sworn to protect the emperor and his dominion. Standing guard on a cold night or cleaning their gear in the barracks, they would talk. Their jokes were quiet, sharp, and cynical. They'd mock the battles being fought inside the palace. Walls battles with wine goblets and silken pillows, not swords and shields. A young recruit might ask an old veteran, "Is it true what they say about the emperor?" The veteran, spitting on the ground, might just grunt. We guard the walls while the wolf is already inside. For these men, who lived and died by discipline, the idea of their leader losing his was more dangerous than any foreign army. Their loyalty, once forged in steel, began to rust with doubt. And then there were the writers, the scholars, poets, and historians who watched the world with a keen eye. Publicly, their brushes painted portraits of a glorious reign. But in private, in their hidden journals and coded letters, they recorded a different history. They wrote of lavish parties that drained the treasury, of important meetings being postponed for trivial amusements, of advisors being chosen for their ability to entertain rather than their wisdom. They knew these stories were a dangerous truth. One wrote, "The foundation of the throne is not stone, but trust," and I see cracks forming everywhere. These hidden records were time bombs, waiting to explode into the history books for future generations to read. Of course, many of these stories were exaggerated. A simple dinner party became a week-long orgy in the retelling. A late night of music became a scene of uncontrollable chaos. But the truth didn't matter as much as the message. The message was clear, and it spread like wildfire. The emperor had lost his way. The discipline that holds an empire together was fraying at its very center. People started to look at the Grand Palace, not with awe, but with suspicion. The respect that a leader commands began to erode, replaced by scorn and disappointment. This is how trust dies, not in a single, dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small whispers, 1,000,000 quiet judgments. The merchants started hedging their bets, looking for other markets. The soldiers began to question whose lives they were really risking. The common people, hearing the tales, felt a growing distance from their ruler. The emperor, isolated in his world of pleasure, was likely the last to know that his greatest asset, faith of his people, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The walls of the palace were still standing, strong and tall. But outside those walls, the foundations of his entire empire were beginning to crumble into dust. It's a powerful lesson from history, isn't it? That a leader's character, their discipline, is the bedrock of their rule. Once that's gone, no army, no treasury, no palace can save them. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more dives into the hidden corners of history. See you next time.